You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. Deuteronomy 6:8 from the ESV. Notes on the book of Esther, number 3. Everything changes when you are remembered. I want to talk about the structure of Esther, how it's mapped out for us, and it's about remembering, as we'll see in a little bit. All right, let's look at the first chapter and a half, almost 2 chapters of Esther. What happens? Well, the king holds a feast in 1 through 9. Then Vashti refuses his summons by the eunuchs. Then wise men advise the king to depose Vashti. Then the king remembers Vashti. He's unhappy. What's he going to do now? Well, call in the wise men again. They give him some advice about how to get a new queen. By the way, just I'll break in here and say, I know there's a lot of confusion or questions or condemnations about the morality of some of this stuff. I'm just not going to deal with that in this presentation, or as I haven't yet, and we'll talk about it maybe sometime in the future. All right, so just let's look at what happens. Wise men advise. Esther is introduced to this point. She's one of the candidates to be the new queen, and she listens to one of the eunuchs, and that's actually her success, her being chosen, to the extent that it depends on her, is ascribed to that wisdom. So it's very much the opposite of Vashti. So what Vashti does to lose the crown, Esther does the opposite to gain the crown, and then there's a feast at the end. Let's take the bullet points out of this. You notice that this begins and ends with the same thing, and it actually has some kind of a mirror image going on. If you put the 4th point, the middle point of the 7, and consider that the pivot point, you'll notice that everything else is related. It's the opposite. A, B, C, C, B, A. That's what's called a chiasm. You notice the heading changing up above. That deserves its own presentation. It's a literary device. Chi is a letter in the Greek language alphabet that looks like an X in the English alphabet, and it refers to devices that somehow communicate by making everything pivot and unwind from a single point. In this case, the centerpiece is the king remembering Vashti, and there's a theology, I believe, behind that, and you'll see it actually comes up again in Esther in a minute. But remember, God remembers. That's something that's all over the Bible. A few examples. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark, and God made the wind blow over the earth, and the water subsided. That actually is in the middle of a huge chiasm that I probably couldn't easily fit on a slideshow. I've already got one of those coming up that's almost too large. So I didn't include that here, but God remembers changes everything in the flood. All the water's heaping up, the rain's coming down, then everything reverses when God remembers Noah. Or, a little bit later, we have God telling Noah, when the bow is in the clouds, remember he established the rainbow, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. That right there throws many conceptions out the window. The bow is not in the sky to remind us of the promise. It's there to remind God of the promise. That itself raises all kinds of questions, but it's what the text explicitly says, so I really am not going to say anything more about it. God remembers. Again, it means that he acts, he changes things, or he will change things, or he'll sustain things. One more example. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew, and God recognized them. And of course, the very next thing is he calls Moses to go back to Egypt. So God remembers, and God acts. This means we actually have the power to remind God of things. And there's a whole bunch of things we could say about that, which we're not going to, but it's in Esther. So here's the deal. We have Esther 1:1 to 2:18 with the king remembers, and that changes everything. Well, does that happen again in the book of Esther? Yeah, it sure does. And there's this huge chiasm that goes from 2:19 all the way to 10:1 through 3, the rest of the book. And it all centers on the king remembering Mordecai's service. The king has a sleepless night, and the king asks for the book of Chronicles to be read to him, and he gets the memo of something that Mordecai had done for him way up there in 2:19 through 20. I think that might be 2:19 through 22. Anyway, 2:19 through the rest of the chapter. He learns something that Mordecai did for which he'd never been honored, and that changes everything. You think everything's leading up to Esther's big confrontation with the king in his little inner palace there, that she risks death to get to him. No, the big turning point is after that. And what you see is that everything is kind of pivots on that. There's Haman at the king's gate, exulting with his family before that. He's mourning with his family after that because he's forced to honor Mordecai. You've got two feasts that Esther has with the king and Haman on either side of that. You have the attack on God's people and the deliverance on God's people. And you have some remarkably similar things going on in those attack and the deliverance that all answer to one another. And you have Mordecai serving the king both before and after. I'm going to argue he's serving him a little bit better afterwards. He's not scheming the way he was scheming and manipulating before, but that, of course, involves things I haven't talked about yet, so we'll just let that go. But the point here is that everything changes when the king remembers. And that's how the book is written. It's meant to be kind of meditated on, and you can see how this all works. This remembering, again, God does this. In fact, God, like the king, has a book. So it's going to be a little bit smaller print, but and not compare to that chiasm, but to what I usually do. Esther 6, 1 through 3. On that night, maybe that should be 1 through 4. I'm not sure. I guess 1 through 3. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And remember, we mentioned those two bodyguards earlier in an earlier presentation. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So, it's a book of remembrance. The king has it read to him, and he remembers Mordecai, and everything changes. This is from Malachi 3:16. Then those who feared Yahweh, of course in the ESV it says the Lord, but I changed it to Yahweh since it's talking about esteeming his name. I thought I should actually use it in this passage. That, again, is probably another presentation for another date. Then those who feared Yahweh spoke with one another, and I have the because I didn't do the change complete. Yahweh paid attention and heard them, and a book of remembrance was written before him of those who feared Yahweh and esteemed his name. So he has a book. He remembers. So Esther, that was a very big, convoluted an order, but it basically is, Esther has two parts, part 1 and part 2. Part 1, the king gets a queen when he remembers, and then part 2, the king gets a new counselor when he remembers. For much more, again, go to wordmp3.com and you can order the audio lectures. I don't know what they cost right now, but it's a great deal. Witness or Perish by James B. Jordan. Okay, thank you all for listening and watching. I'll see you at our next presentation.